Ooh, another white boy with a podcast. Pronouns, Jim Bro. Another white boy with a podcast. You want to see the video? It went viral.
Hi Gains Gurus and welcome to TMGP, the Muscle Growth Podcast, episode 31. I am your host, Roscoe, and today we are welcoming Daniel Plotkin onto the show for part 2 of this 2-part series. Daniel Plotkin is making waves in the world of exercise science and muscle physiology, currently pursuing his PhD at Auburn University. Daniel is not just a researcher, he's a passionate advocate for evidence-based fitness practices that can help individuals achieve their muscle growth goals. Daniel's journey into the realm of muscle physiology began with his own passion for fitness and strength training. Over the years, he has immersed himself in understanding the intricate mechanisms that drive muscle hypertrophy, the process of increasing muscle size. His commitment to unraveling the complexities of how our bodies respond to different types of training has positioned him as a thought leader in the field. One of Daniel's most notable contributions to the fitness community is his recent research comparing the effectiveness of squats versus hip thrusts for muscle growth. This study has sparked considerable interest among trainers, athletes, and fitness enthusiasts alike, as it challenges traditional notions about which exercises are most beneficial for building strength and size in the lower body. Daniel will share practical science-based takeaways that listeners can incorporate into their own lives. This episode isn't just about research, it's about real-world application. You will find valuable insights to enhance your understanding of studies related to hypertrophy and the basics for getting jacked. The simple stuff. Beyond his research, Daniel is dedicated to advancing our understanding of muscle growth through education and outreach. He believes that by sharing knowledge and fostering a community grounded in science, we can all make better decisions regarding our health and fitness journeys. So, whether you're a gym goer looking to maximize your gains or a coach seeking evidence-based strategies for your clients, this episode promises to be both enlightening and engaging. Join us as we explore the fascinating world of muscle physiology with Daniel Plotkin. In today's episode, we dive into a wide range of insights. Some of the topics include: how are sets counted in research? Why is it so difficult to know exactly in terms of a stimulus ratio per exercise? Why are EMG studies obsolete? Optimal set ranges for muscle growth. Experimentation. Volume. Maximum effective volume. Maintenance volume. Minimum effective volume. Diminishing returns volume. Maximum growth for given value or given volume. Maximum growth potential. Factors affecting muscle growth: sleep, stress, protein, calories. Practical takeaways: sets per muscle per session, training close to failure, volume. Individual variability: why is it so hard to provide for individuals? Practical takeaways for experienced lifters, and so much more. Get ready for a truly informative episode. If you're injured or in recovery, visit theinjuryconsultant.com and schedule a free consultation to explore how I can support your healing, restoration, and journey to thriving health. The Injury Consultant now offers specialized packages for fat loss, muscle gain, and longevity. Interested? Book your free consult today. A little disclaimer: this show does not contain medical advice. The views and opinions expressed by guests on the Muscle Growth Podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect my beliefs or the stance of the podcast. While we aim to provide valuable insights and information, it's important to approach all topics with critical thinking. I encourage you to do your own research, consider multiple perspectives, and form your own conclusions. Healthy discussion is always welcome, and I'm happy to engage with listeners in the comments to continue the conversation. Lastly, don't forget to follow us on all major social media platforms, including Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and X. Find us at the Muscle Growth Podcast and myself at Reps with Roscoe. So, how are sets counted in research? And current volume studies, I think they're either 0 or 1. Is that correct? And how would you count a set in research?
Yeah, so typically they are counted as either 0 or 1. And there's obviously limitations to that from a application standpoint, but within the context of research, I don't think how you count it matters too much as long as you use a consistent way of counting for the particular study. So because you're controlling all the other variables, let's say I count a bench press as one for tricep and one for chest, then the other group is still using that same counting mechanism. So, and they're using the same exercises, very importantly, that a 0 or 1 ends up being pretty useful as just a tool to put a number on it. But that exact number doesn't matter that much when we're comparing within a study. But when you compare across studies, then you could actually make arguments for using fractions and so on, because now you're trying to get at, all right, how do I use this to apply to my training, as opposed to within the study itself, it doesn't necessarily matter which number you use because of the fact that all of the other variables are accounted for. But when you're training, all the other variables aren't accounted for. Obviously, I could use one specific exercise for tricep. I could use, let's say, a tricep overhead versus a bench press. There's going to be distinct differences between those two exercises, and how I choose one versus the other in my own training is going to be important. While in a study, both groups are doing the bench press and the tricep overhead. So how I count sets in order to see whether there's a dose response relationship for volume is accounted for because of the fact that they're using the same exercises, they're using the same rest period, and so on. But a recent meta-regression, in order to try to get at seeing how do we apply this to our own training, actually used fractional sets. So they used 0.5 for everything that was a synergist, so where it wasn't the prime mover, quote unquote, for an exercise. And that's honestly going to be subjective as well. But if you're trying to get at, all right, how many sets should people do in the world, as opposed to trying to isolate a question in a study, making some of those decisions is probably a good idea. So you realize the limitations of using the fractions, but also realize the upside of using the fractions when you're saying, all right, this is how many sets you should do per week, while realizing that we're counting indirect sets. So rows will count as 0.5 for bicep and 1 for lats, and presses will count as 1 for chest, 0.5 for tricep. So that way, when you get that final number, you can actually contextualize that final number. But that's only when you're trying to apply that to training. Within a study itself, how you count is a bit less important because of the fact that you're accounting for all of the other variables. Hopefully that makes sense. I rambled on there a bit.
No, that makes perfect sense. Would, for example, let's use bench press because everyone loves bench, except for me. But anyway, and people with long arms. Would you say that chest, let's go with 1 again for bench for chest, and then you said maybe 0.5 in this particular case of the synergistic for the tricep, and would you also say 0.5 for maybe the front delts?
Yeah. That's how they went about going. Okay. That's how they went about doing things for the meta-analysis they did. Okay. And I think I agree with that largely.
I like that. I think, although I know you just suggested not to go too deeply into it, I think I am going to look at my programming and try add the 0.5 just to make it slightly more optimized. But like you said, it's probably not necessary. But I have actually tried to do something like that in the past. But I think now I will just use 0.5 and 1 and 0 in my new program.
Yeah, so I think... to continue on the bench press topic, I think it's a very reasonable fraction to say 0.5 anterior delt, 0.5 tricep, and 1 chest. And I think that's a good way to even sort of conceptualize it for your own training. But the reason I think that for your own training it matters even less is because you can just get a sense for what you're trying to do within your program, where you don't necessarily have to put a fraction onto these things because the fraction is somewhat arbitrary. The reason why the fractions are useful for a meta-analysis, especially a meta-regression, is because you need to put a number on things. You're trying to quantify what that dose response is. But for you as an individual, just realizing that, oh, the long head of the tricep is going to get less stimulus in the bench press, and just realizing that the rec sets are probably going to be a bit more stimulus. What that bit actually is not super, super important within the context of your overall program if you're covering your bases adequately and just realizing the limitations while you program. But when you're actually trying to quantify variables and trying to see what the dose response is, you have to make those decisions because there needs to be a quantification. But in your own programming, you're like, all right, I want to just do a couple of exercises that are not isolation exercises, a couple of exercises that are isolation exercises that historically and through the literature are probably going to end up being, about 18 or so sets for tricep, let's say, total. And that's if you count it as one. But if you count it as 1 and 0.5, it might be something like a 14 or a 12 and so on. So the exact number for your own training matters a lot less in terms of how you count it, because of the fact that you know what you're doing in terms of covering your bases. You know that those compounds are going to hit a muscle a particular way and those isolation movements are going to hit it this way. You know how you typically recover from the two, and you can just create a good, well-rounded program while being within the ballpark of those volume recommendations, regardless of how they're actually counted. But as I was saying, if you were trying to quantify things from a research standpoint, then you have to put a number on. Yeah, I think 0.5 is probably the most reasonable way to go about doing things because of the fact that it's just easy
exactly.
in terms
of...
it's
so easy.
All right, I'm going to go 0.510. Yeah. But if you start getting into really weird areas where it's like, all right, how deep are we going to get?
0.27. Yeah. No, it's arbitrary. Exactly.
Yeah, so I think practically speaking, using 0.5 versus 1 is something that's super useful just in terms of allowing you to have that level of binary choice when you have weird fractions where if you start trying to rank exercises, you'll end up in a super weird area where, okay, if this is biased, let's say a seated hamstring curl versus lying hamstring curl, there's some evidence that the seated hamstring curl is more hypertrophic. Are we going to count that as a 1.2 now? Or, so it just ends up being super weird where I think as long as you make a decision and know why you're making that decision, then that's good, as opposed to trying to make it perfect and then ending up in a super weird area where you don't even know what the number means anymore because you applied so many weird fractions and made it so convoluted. So I would say just try to keep it simple when you do it. And if you're going to count sets, I'd probably go with something that is either the binary 1 or 0 while keeping in mind the indirect sets, or going 1.5. And then now you have accounted for the direct sets. But just as an example, let's say you use the 1 for the bicep, you'll just know that that volume is going to end up higher because for all the back exercises, the bicep counted as 1. So when you think about that 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week number, you know that you're going to be on the higher end, if not a bit higher than 20 for the bicep, if you count all the rowing as 1. But if you decided to count it as 0.5, then all right, now it's going to end up more within the realm of that 10 to 20. So it's something that you can just either account for intellectually, or if you're going to use a number, just make those numbers simple and understandable.
Absolutely. I really like that advice. Like you said, the 1.2 for, I think you said, seated versus lying. Like you said, it can just get super messy, and that can go even further. Like if you, for example, put your seat further back on like a leg extension, now is it different to if it's at the front, because you might have a slightly different stimulus, and it's actually just too many factors. It's going to make your life so much more difficult, and we'll go right back to the beginning. Keep it simple, consistency and hard work. That'll be better than trying to maximize or optimize rather your exact sets and your exact putting an arbitrary number on a particular exercise for a particular muscle. I would have suggested a few years ago using EMGs to try and adjust. But now we know that EMGs are maybe not actually a great indicator of muscle growth. And that's just an example of how I've changed my opinion on something. Do you mind elaborating on why EMGs are now actually not considered very useful for basically, I guess, measuring muscle growth or stimulus, all that kind of thing?
Yeah, so there's a decent amount of reasons why you should be at least cautious when using the tool. So I think often you'll have situations where it's like, all right, if the EMG is blaring in one area and just crickets in another, you could be pretty decently confident that the muscle is getting less juice, quote unquote, for the crickets example. But when things start to get a little bit murky, especially when exercises are hard in different positions, especially when you need to account for passive tension, just realizing what the EMG is measuring, which is excitation, so the amount of signal that's being sent by the nervous system, but not the actual activation, so the cross bridges and so on. So once you fatigue, you also have issues with correlating excitation and activation. So just tons of things that make it at least a murky enough relationship where oftentimes my question is, if something is fairly obvious from a biomechanical standpoint or from the research that showed actual outcomes standpoint, and the EMG confirms that, that's cool. But are there areas where the EMG can actually give you information that you couldn't have gleaned otherwise that would change your decision making? And I think as it currently stands, there's not really an area where I see the EMG allowing me to make inferences about something that I wouldn't already have come to that conclusion generally with some other route. So can it help in the decision-making process? Yes or no? And oftentimes the answer is no. I'm open to in the future there being ways in which it is useful to just use EMG in order to come to a specific conclusion, but at least currently I'm very skeptical without direct evidence.
Absolutely. And I mean, I mentioned Built with Science. They had a lot of videos on EMGs, and I followed them, and I thought that, this is proof. This is definitely proof that this is the best exercise. And I chose my program based on Built with Science's advice, which is in hindsight not the right way to do it, because as someone explained, the EMG can literally change based on your positioning. So, for example, if you put it in one part of your body for your chest, for example, and then obviously everyone's chest has a different kind of shape, even if it's minimally different, it's not going to be the exact same place on everyone, which will give not a completely different result, but arguably a different result enough that it's actually no longer useful.
Yeah, there's a lot of contexts where the EMG will give readings that aren't necessarily mapping on to what we would expect in terms of even excitation. So you can think of the glute during a hip thrust, it kind of bunches up at the top of the hip thrust. So it's hardest in the shortened position, and you see really, really high amounts of excitation there. And so what that means from an actual hypertrophy standpoint is still up in the air. So I just think that using it as a tool to generate some weak hypotheses, I think is useful. But trying to actually come to a strong conclusion, I think would definitely be a mistake. As you get into areas that like the movements are super similar and so on, and the velocities are similar, then maybe you can make some better hypotheses, but I'm just not convinced that you can come to, until I see evidence that shows that you can actually see direct effects from the inferences that you draw from EMG. I'm just not convinced that it's a useful tool at the present moment. But that's not to discount EMG as a tool for other things.
Yeah.
So I think people, anytime they look at EMG research, they're like, oh, EMG is bullshit. And I think the hypertrophy community might have created that when there's actually a lot of really, really cool EMG research with indwelling EMG that look at when motor units actually come online. So motor unit recruitment, and you can also measure the firing rate with indwelling EMG and also high density EMG. So basically trying to get at, all right, how is this movement actually being created in terms of the threshold at which motor units are recruited and the rate at which motor units fire. So I think that's some really cool research using usually more advanced EMG. So can there be conclusions drawn in a clinical setting? Can there be conclusions drawn from a specific, what are you looking at from what the nervous system is doing setting? Sure. But trying to map on things to hypertrophy is, on very shaky ground currently.
Absolutely. And you make a great point about not discarding it for other uses, and but maybe for the purpose of hypertrophy, we leave it for now. So you've mentioned the 10 to 20 set range a few times. Can you just very briefly elaborate on that? And second question, how would you adapt that now? Say someone like myself wants to use the 0.5 for an indirect set. Would you say that now I should maybe look at 7.5 to 15? Or keep it 5 to 10 or tip 5 to 15? What would your opinion be on adapting that set range now based on the 0.5 inclusion?
Yeah, so just briefly, I think that the vast majority of evidence shows that moderate set volumes are higher than lower set volumes. So, doing something like 12 versus 6 pretty confidently gets greater growth across studies, and there's much less variability there. Once you get up to, 20 plus, when you're counting sets as one, then you have some neutral studies, but still a decent amount of positive studies. So there's still a signal for there being greater growth at much higher volumes, but there's a point of diminishing returns at those higher volumes. So if you want to pick up all the gains possible, experimenting with those higher volumes is probably a good idea, but experimenting with those higher volumes usually means experimenting with a couple of muscle groups while other muscles are doing less volume, because most of the studies are looking at a couple of muscle groups, not the whole body. So training the whole body at, 25, 30 sets, probably not the best idea. So long story short, moderate volumes probably get you the most bang for your buck. If you're really trying to experiment with a given muscle, going higher volumes might be a good idea, at least for experimentation. But when you do that experimentation, just realize don't smash every muscle with those high volumes, because then just systemically, and people who have tried it generally are, in the same boat, that just trying to get every single muscle group to 30 is a nightmare for the vast majority of people. There are people that can tolerate it, especially over time, but it's few and far in between, and probably not worth the effort in terms of the amount of bang for your buck per set. And then when it comes to adjusting that number with the 0.5, I think you can adjust it downward a bit. So probably something that looks more like an 8 to 16 type deal, maybe an 8 to 15. But for me, it's more about just looking at the actual program than it is really. That's why it's a wide range, like 10 to 20. They're like, well, how the heck am I supposed to, 10 to 20 is a super wide range. How many sets should I do? Just tell me. Stop keeping the secret, so that way you can get jacked. And exactly, gatekeeping. So it's a wide enough range where I think the range gives people the wiggle room to choose the exercises that make the most sense for them, while not necessarily getting too bogged down with that exact number. But yeah, you can scale it downwards slightly if you're doing the 0.5, particularly for certain muscle groups. That's why it gets a little murky, because those recommendations would be most effective for things that are involved in a lot of compound exercises. So, the tricep, bicep, and so on, that could be scaled downward, while the muscle groups that, like for the VL, for example, the vastus lateralis, is getting a whole bunch of direct volume where you're probably not going to scale it because of the fact that the vast majority of the studies are just counting it as one, and then rightfully so, because it's going to be one in the leg press and the leg extension, if that makes sense. So it'll be muscle specific. And that's why I can't give like a for sure you can scale it down for every muscle type deal, but it's a wide enough range that usually you can come to a pretty decent conclusion with some experimentation.
Absolutely. And you make a good point about experimentation. Find what works for you and then do that. Very briefly, can we just quickly touch on volume landmarks, maintenance volume, minimum effective volume, maximum adaptive volume, and maximum recoverable volume?
Yeah, so these were originally coined by Dr. Mike Israetel, where it's essentially the volume that's needed in order to maintain the amount of gains you have. That would be maintenance volume. So that's probably around, 3 to 5. A decent amount of evidence for 3, but those 3 studies, 3 set per week studies, were generally in people that just did a 12-week program and then dropped down their volume. So that's only if you consider a trained individual, a person who's been training for 3 months, right? And then you have minimum effective volume. So the amount of volume, the lowest amount of volume needed in order to make some gains. And then you have maximum adaptive volume, which is the maximum amount of sets that you can do and get the most gains. So the amount of sets needed in order to get the most gains. And then you have maximum recoverable volume, which is that extra volume that you can do while still maintaining performance. So you could technically do more volume than would give you the most gains, but still recover and still continue to add a little bit of load, but it doesn't necessarily get you more muscle mass. So those are generally the volume landmarks there.
And I think, and then the diminishing returns volume, is that a new indicator from yourself, or is that still coming with your proposed indicators like maximum growth for given volume and a maximum growth potential?
Yeah, so those are 2 that I came up with, maximum growth for a given volume and maximum growth potential. And the reason I found those useful is because they're talking more about growth as opposed to talking about volume. So the reason why the volume landmarks can sometimes get confusing for people is because they change with different contexts. So if you do less frequency, for example, let's say you train 1 time per week, your maximum adaptive volume, your maximum recoverable, all of those are going to change based on that specific frequency. So you can only look at the volume landmarks within the context of your given program, the exercises that you're doing, the volumes that you're doing, and the frequency that you're doing. All of those things are baked into that equation, even rest periods and so on. But maximum growth potential and maximum growth at a given volume gives you a theoretical, how much growth am I actually going to get from whatever the case may be. So a really good example of this is, let's say, sleep. If you sleep more, you could potentially increase your maximum growth potential, right? The amount of growth that you can get, or the maximum amount of growth that you can get. But you can also at the same time decrease your maximum adaptive volume. You can do less volume and get the same gains potentially, and the amount you can grow total is also higher. So it allows you to adapt things to even variables outside of set volume.
You mentioned sleep as a factor. What are some other factors affecting muscle growth?
Yeah, so you'll get, sleep, you'll get just general recovery, so making sure that you're not stressed. There's protein, so making sure you're getting adequate protein. There's calories, so how many calories are you consuming? Are you at maintenance? Are you in a surplus? And so on. So all of those things can affect your maximum growth potential, and they could even modulate what you can do volume-wise. So if you're not getting adequate protein, if you're not getting adequate sleep, if you're not getting adequate calories and so on, that changes your volume landmarks and it changes your growth potential. So having those 2 to play with in terms of conceptually, I think is useful. And then maximum growth at a given volume allows you to essentially say, all right, I'm not necessarily trying to maximize, or even if I am, it allows you to see whether the exercises you're using is what is giving you the most bang for your buck. So let's say we go back to that seated hamstring curl example. if you do a seated hamstring, if you're only doing 3 sets for the whole week and you're only worried about hamstring growth, the maximum growth at the given volume of 3 sets would be higher with the seated hamstring curl than the lying hamstring curl. So now you have something where you can say, all right, I can actually choose different exercises and give myself a conceptual landmark of how much growth I'm going to get at this given volume using the exercises of choice. So basically, it just expands the vocabulary that you can use while quickly telling yourself or an individual what they can expect and why you're making that decision. Am I getting the most growth for a given volume? Am I getting the most growth potential? So am I maximizing all of those variables, and which variables modulate those things?
Absolutely. And in terms of the practical takeaways, so still 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week, but then how many sets per muscle group per session?
Yeah, I generally don't like to go above 9. So basically, if you're going to try to maximize the growth for a given muscle, I like to train it at least 2 times per week with no more than 9 sets per session. And that includes indirect sets as one. So that I think is a pretty good heuristic. Usually I won't even go above, 6 or 7 for a given muscle group within the session, but I think 9 is a pretty decent rule. And so if you go 9 times 2, that's 18. That's the higher range, so 2 times per week. But then if you see that, your recovery capability and just like I call it like session RPE. So like how you feel toward the end of the session when you're doing that last exercise, and if you're giving all of that juice, if you end up doing a higher set number for that session and you don't feel like you're able to get that same level of energy and getting a lot of productive sets, then you can increase frequency, obviously, and then try that out. But as a good general rule, I'd say, 9 as a cap per session and 20 at the higher end for the vast majority of individuals for most muscle groups. But like we were talking about earlier, there's definitely room for some specialization and so on.
Absolutely. And on that specialization note, why do you think that individual variability is often missed, especially online?
Why do you think individual variability what?
Is often missed, especially online, like with cookie cutter programs and people just saying, do this with this. Why do you think it's missed?
Yeah, I think there's probably 2 reasons. One is because individual variability is actually really hard to research. So if you read, I think the lead author is Zach Robinson, but it could be a different lead author, but it's his paper basically talking about how to actually get at individual differences in research, and it's really, really hard. The study designs necessary in order to actually get at that question are hard to do and often sometimes impossible to do. So it goes back to earlier in our conversation where how can we sort of fill the void? We can either make really strong claims about how to individualize, or we can go as cookie cutter as possible and make really strong claims and not worry about individualization at all. And obviously those 2 camps would be both incorrect. You sort of find a middle ground where, all right, here are general heuristics, here's what the evidence says, and I'll modulate things for myself, experiment, while also just realizing that, you could be wrong, but directionally, if things are going well, don't stop that train, right? I don't care if I'm doing something that is not necessarily, the most evidence-based, if that's even a thing. If it's working and if I'm growing, don't stop that train, because it's way worse to try to optimize things when things are going well and end up in a place where you're not even sure what the heck is going on. So stick with something if it's working. It would be my 2 cents there.
Absolutely. If it's not broken, don't fix it.
Yeah, for sure.
What are some of the best practical takeaways you can list for people? I know it's a very broad question, but just off the top of your head, what would you say are some of the best practical takeaways?
Yeah, I think just making sure that most of your sets are pretty close to failure. So, within that 3 to 0 range. So for RIR, I think making sure you do moderate amount of volume, start on the lower end, try to milk those gains, see how you feel, and then experiment upwards, I think is a useful heuristic instead of the opposite, where start at really high volumes and then, that you might end up in a place where, especially as a beginner, you're sort of spinning your wheels. I think making sure that you have a program that is relatively flexible, that allows for you to, if you miss a day, to pick things up is a really big one for people who are trying to find issues or trying to find that level of consistency where they have super nice programs. They actually look really good, but the way they're structured makes it so that if they miss a day, then it kind of throws everything off. While if you have even slightly less frequency or you have more full body days and so on, then you allow for some leeway, and that allows you to stay on track, which is the biggest variable. That's something that I see often in people that are really, really passionate, where they create the perfect looking program, but not necessarily the perfect program for execution. And then honestly, people undervalue outside the gym. So making sure that you really covet those things that will be good for growth, making sure you get adequate sleep, making sure that you don't get into too many online fights and increase your cortisol and lose gains because you're worrying about minor details that are really not going to affect your training. So I think the biggest thing that I always go back to is, how is this, whenever you consume something online or whenever you're trying to create your training, how is this actually going to affect outcomes, and how much does it matter for you or the individual you're working with? And oftentimes people miss the forest for the trees. So just focus on the big rocks while making adjustments on the smaller rocks in the cases where it's warranted, and not tinkering on the outside and jumping from program to program constantly because you're trying to look for sort of the best thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned a lot of practical takeaways, and that's fantastic. And I hope that the listeners gain a lot of insight from all of that. An interesting one you mentioned is not making it sustainable, and then also not jumping. And I think a lot of, especially you mentioned new lifters, might even have a really cool program, a really good one, but if they miss a day, the whole program goes out the window, or it's not, like, they can't pick it back up. So that's a really cool piece of advice there. What would you say is the most practical, or some of the best practical takeaways for experienced lifters? Like, what are some of the things that can give the experienced guys like that inkling of an edge?
Yeah, with more experienced people, it ends up often being more trial and error, and them really listening to their own bodies, at least from my experience, where oftentimes I think, especially with experienced guys in the evidence-based community, they look at evidence that shows neutral effect and think that it doesn't matter at all. Where I would say that for those people in particular, that's where they can play the most in terms of really trying to hammer either form or modulate programming variables in a way that can have them continue to progress. So for example, let's just say tempo. I think that it's a very common trope that it matters very, very little. And I think, generally speaking, I think that it's not a variable that people should, overly focus on, but using tempo as a tool can actually be super useful. And I've found it to be useful in a particular exercise or a given exercise, where I do think, even though there's not evidence there, that you can milk more gains by finding the right tempo for a given exercise, even if it's not because you get more hypertrophy for a given set, but because you can consistently do it and find that mind-muscle connection with the given muscle and stay injury-free with that exercise because you found that groove with a particular tempo. So my advice would be to play in those areas where the evidence is neutral and find those tenets that work for you for either the given exercise or programming and so on.
And what do you see as the next big trends or areas of research in muscle growth and exercise science?
The next big trend, there's a lot of stuff in terms of like technologically that would be, super cool in terms of we're getting better and better at measuring muscle protein synthesis. We're getting better and better at measuring proteins that are related to anabolism. So I think more and more quickly, we're going to see some candidate proteins that are potentially really good anabolic markers. So that's from like a research side of things. But from a practical side of things, I'm not sure that I see, super strong trends from this will change the game standpoint as it relates to training. I think often we look for that stuff, but I would just be pretty surprised. But by the same token, maybe AI will allow that to take off, where you get sort of personalized, biofeedback that allows you to actually see how much anabolism that you're getting in real time. But yeah, I don't think I have any super, super strong candidates for what will be sort of the next big thing, other than I think that we're getting better and better at just simply doing the studies that are the necessary next step. While earlier on, it was kind of the Wild West in terms of, especially when we were a really young field, there were a lot of, differing viewpoints on what even volume quantification is and so on. So you see a lot of older studies that did stuff that's kind of a head scratcher, like stopping sets well short of failure in order to equate for work and so on. We're like, oh man, like, how are we going to take any practical takeaways from this study? So I think just putting our foot on the pedal and slowly, allowing those boats to rise while answering the necessary next step will be a really cool frontier. I think the biggest thing proximally that might be something that we really parse in research is when certain muscles grow in different positions and how they grow regionally in different positions, and why they grow regionally in different positions is probably the most proximate frontier that I see, at least in the hypertrophy literature. It's like, all right, with this range of motion, which exercise and which position will grow the glute better versus the quad, and so on. And then positionally within the muscle, proximal, mid, distal, when is that going to grow in different exercises? I think we're going to get better and better at maybe knowing why, but at least knowing if, in terms of actual outcomes between exercises, because it does seem to be something that is on a lot of people's radar. So that's maybe one of the most imminent changes that we'll probably see.
And you're gatekeeping the rest. No, I'm kidding.
There are actually some things that I've seen in the reason why I was talking about the molecular stuff. There's some cool stuff that I've seen that I can't actually talk about because it wasn't my lab.
That's fine.
So I don't want to shine light on it before they present their findings. But yeah, it's there's some cool stuff on that side of things.
Well, that's exciting. We'll have to have you or some of the your colleagues who on that paper on the podcast to talk about them when they're published.
Yeah, for sure.
Very exciting. And then, in closing off, what advice or parting words of wisdom do you have for our listeners who are looking to embark on their own journey of muscle growth and health? I know you've talked a lot about all these things. I did mention that you might have to reiterate it at the end, but just for continuity's sake, what are your closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest thing, if somebody was starting on the journey, or even honestly for somebody that's, in the middle of the journey, is find someone who embodies what you sort of enjoy in terms of communication style and what they know, how they know it, and then really allow them to either coach you or mentor you. I think that's honestly, in terms of something that I didn't cover, a really, really good unlock where you can have really good conversations. You can have a perspective of being coached and basically allow yourself to go through their mistakes way more quickly by having a person that is ahead of you that has gone through all those trials and tribulations. So a mentor, I think, is something that I would not undervalue at all. Oftentimes people worry about the price tag there, but I think it's well worth the price in the vast majority of cases to just find somebody that's ahead of you that can help you get through all the stuff that you would have got wrong for years. So in terms of practical advice, I think that's probably the most practical, especially for a beginner. I wish I had someone that very early on was just like, you don't have to bench 6 times a week. Things that, I mean, I just did absurd things when I was in high school where I just thought more is better. And I was wrestling at the time too. So I just, accumulated some injuries and whatnot just because I was training like an idiot. So there's definitely tons and tons of things that can be learned from somebody that's either 1 step or 5 steps above you. Just try to create a community or at least have somebody where you can bounce ideas off of and is an individual that you respect and is even keeled and so on. I think that's probably the quickest fast track to leveling up your knowledge and leveling up your abilities.
Absolutely. I think that's fantastic advice. And if people are looking to level up their knowledge through you, how would be best to find you?
Yeah. So the 2 places are slowly on YouTube. I put out stuff, but pretty slowly, but I'm trying to get a little bit better at putting it out. Right now, it's probably more like once a month, but I'm really trying to sort of build a foundation for people with my YouTube videos. And then Instagram, I'm pretty active on Instagram. So those would be the 2 places to find me.
And your handles?
Oh yeah, Daniel Plotkin, just my name. So Daniel_Plotkin on YouTube and just Daniel Plotkin at Daniel Plotkin on Instagram.
Fantastic, Daniel. Thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. And all the best with your doctorate research and all the other papers that I see or your name's always on. Don't know how you have time for all of them, but thank you so much for all your contributions to science and for all the ones to come. Really appreciate it. And best of luck with everything. And I can't wait to see the next thing you come up with and out your lab and everything. And thanks again.
Thank you, man.
Thank you for tuning in to the Muscle Growth Podcast. If you found value in today's episode, we'd really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating and a quick review. It helps us grow and reach more people just like you. Don't forget to follow us on all major social media platforms, including Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and X. Find us at the Muscle Growth Podcast and at Reps with Roscoe. For more insights, exclusive content, and full episodes, visit themusclegrowthpodcast.com. Your support truly makes a difference, so please like, share, comment, and follow. We're grateful for every bit of it. Until next time, keep pushing your limits and staying focused on getting bigger, stronger, and better.